I used to think family implosions happened slowly, that they unraveled over years, with warning signs and quiet resentments piling up until something finally snapped. I was wrong. Sometimes a family doesn't fall apart, it detonates. And all it takes is one night, one phone call, and one truth you can never unsee. 3 weeks ago, my younger sister showed up outside my apartment at 11:30 p.m., still wearing her volleyball uniform, her backpack clenched to her chest like a life raft. Her eyes were swollen. Her hands were shaking so badly I had to steady them when I opened the door. She didn't say hello. She didn't say my name. She just looked at me and whispered, "I think Mom is cheating on Dad." That sentence didn't feel real at first. It felt like something misheard, like static on a bad connection. My parents had been married for over 25 years. They weren't perfect, but they were solid, predictable, safe. Or so I thought. Within the next hour, everything I believed about my family cracked wide open. By morning, my fathers would be filing for divorce. By the end of the week, my 16-year-old sister would be packing her bags. And by the end of the month, I would realize that the woman who raised us was capable of manipulation so extreme it would terrify me. But none of that was clear yet. All I knew in that moment was this. My sister had walked into our childhood home expecting to grab a phone charger and instead walked in on a betrayal she was never supposed to see. I remember sitting on my couch that night, listening to her uneven breathing as she tried to explain what she'd witnessed. I remember the way my stomach dropped, heavy and cold, when the details became too specific to deny. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that hurt more than shock ever could, once you confront the truth, you don't get to choose what it destroys. You only get to decide whether you'll look away or let it burn everything down. My name is Dylan, and that's the first thing I need to fix, because this story didn't happen to a man anymore. My name is Dahlia, and I'm 28 years old. I live about 20 minutes from my childhood home in a modest apartment I share with my boyfriend Henry, who's 26. He has this calm, grounded energy, like the kind of person who doesn't make problems bigger just because he's scared. He listens first. He steadies the room without needing to be loud about it. And for a long time, that was what my family felt like too. My father, David, is 54. He's an electrician with his own small business. Steady hands, steady voice, steady routines. The kind of man who shows love through fixing things you didn't even know were broken. If the porch light flickered at your house, he would be there in 10 minutes with a toolbox and a quiet joke. My mother, Lisa, is 51. She works part-time at a dental office, and she's always been vibrant, social, energetic in a way that pulled attention into her orbit. Growing up, she was the fun mom in my friends' eyes. She organized things, decorated for holidays like it was her job, kept the pantry stocked with snacks no other house had. And then there's my little sister, Sophie. She's 16, still living at home, still technically the baby. She's a junior in high school and plays volleyball. She's tall for her age, all long limbs and restless energy, but she's also sensitive in a way she tries to hide with sarcasm. When she laughs, she does this snorting little thing she hates, and I tease her about it every time, because she needs someone in her life who can tease her without hurting her. Sophie and I have always been close, even with the age gap. When I was in college, she used to call me late at night whenever she was stressed out, about school, about friends, about our parents. Back then, I'd sit in a dorm hallway whispering into my phone so my roommate wouldn't wake up, telling Sophie to breathe, telling her she wasn't crazy, telling her she'd be okay. Even after I moved out, we never stopped. We text almost every day. She comes over at least once a week. Sometimes she sprawls on my couch like she lives here, scrolling through videos while Henry pretends to be annoyed. But he always ends up bringing her snacks anyway. Henry likes her. Sophie likes Henry too, which is rare. Sophie doesn't trust easily, but Henry treats her like she matters, like she's not just a kid. He asks about her games. He remembers her friends' names. He listens when she talks. And for a while I thought, this is what family is supposed to feel like. It's important you understand that I didn't grow up in a home where I expected betrayal. My parents weren't the couple who screamed at each other in front of us. They weren't the type to slam doors. My dad rarely raised his voice. My mom could get dramatic sometimes, sure, but it always felt contained, like whatever issues they had stayed behind closed doors. There were ups and downs, like any marriage that lasted decades, but nothing that ever made me think, one day this will explode. Then, 6 months ago, Mom joined a new fitness center. At first, I actually felt relieved about it. She'd been complaining about feeling tired, about her weight fluctuating, about not feeling like herself. The gym seemed like a good outlet. She started going almost every day. She came home with that post-workout glow, talking about protein shakes and new routines, laughing about the people she met there. She also started spending more time with her sister Carol. Carol lives in the next town over and has always been Mom's closest confidant. They talk constantly. They meet for coffee, go shopping, swap gossip like it's oxygen. If you asked me then, I would have said Mom was doing great. Healthy, active, social. I didn't think of it as distance. I didn't think of it as secrecy. Because that's the thing about families like mine. You're trained to believe stability is the default. So when Sophie calls me that Friday night, voice cracked, words trembling, my brain fought the reality like it was a foreign language. My first instinct wasn't rage. It was disbelief. Mom wouldn't. Then Sophie showed up at my building, in the dark, with her backpack, red eyes, still in her volleyball uniform, and I realized she wasn't calling to gossip. She was calling because she'd seen something that made her feel unsafe inside her own home. And that's when the story truly began. Because that night wasn't just about cheating. It was about the moment a 16-year-old girl learned that adulthood doesn't protect you from trauma. And the moment I realized that protecting Sophie might mean destroying the version of our family we all pretended was real. Looking back now, the signs were there. They just didn't look like warnings at the time. They looked like normal life shifting slightly out of focus. My dad had been spending more weekends at Uncle Mike's place, helping with a long overdue kitchen renovation. It wasn't unusual. Dad was the kind of person who couldn't say no when family needed help. Every Friday or Saturday, he'd pack his tools, promise to be home soon, and come back tired but satisfied, smelling faintly of sawdust and coffee. Mom never complained about it. That should have stood out more than it did. Instead, she filled her time. The gym, Carol, long phone calls behind closed doors, new clothes, new routines. She started caring a lot about how she looked when she went out, even for small errands. At the time, I told myself it was confidence, reinvention, midlife energy. I wanted that story to be true. Sophie noticed things before I did. She mentioned once that Mom seemed distracted, like she was always checking her phone. She said Mom snapped more easily, then overcorrected by being overly affectionate 5 minutes later. One night, Sophie joked that Mom acted like she was auditioning for something. I laughed it off. I wish I hadn't. Because what Sophie was really describing was inconsistency, emotional whiplash, the kind that makes a teenager second-guess their instincts. The night everything cracked open, Sophie wasn't even supposed to be home. She'd planned a sleepover at her teammate Jessica's house after a volleyball game, something they'd coordinated weeks in advance. My parents had approved it without hesitation. Sophie had packed her bag, kissed Mom goodbye, and left wearing her jersey and sneakers, excited and carefree. But she forgot her phone charger, something so small, so ordinary. Jessica's mom dropped her off around 10 p.m. Sophie used her key to let herself in, expecting a quiet, dark house. Dad was supposed to be away. Mom knew Sophie wouldn't be home. That's the detail that still makes my chest tighten. Because Sophie didn't stumble onto a mistake. She walked into a moment that assumed she didn't exist. She told me later that she heard noises first. Laughing, movement, sounds she didn't recognize as wrong until her body reacted before her brain could catch up. As she moved closer, reality snapped into focus in a way that doesn't fade. She didn't go looking. She just saw. She didn't scream. She didn't confront anyone. She grabbed her charger from the kitchen counter, hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it, and ran. She didn't even go back to the sleepover. She had Jessica's mom drop her off near my building instead, too ashamed, too overwhelmed to explain why she didn't want to be there anymore. When she told me all this on my couch, she kept apologizing. I shouldn't have been there, she kept saying, like the crime was existing at the wrong time. That's when something hardened inside me. I needed to know if this was real. Not because I doubted Sophie, but because my brain was scrambling for any explanation that didn't involve my mother dismantling our family. I checked my dad's social media first. He'd been active earlier that evening, commented on a photo, liked a post. That meant he wasn't home. I messaged him. He called me back within 5 minutes. I could hear a television in the background. He sounded relaxed, normal. He told me he was at Uncle Mike's place and planned to stay there through the weekend. That was the moment denial became impossible. Telling him was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I spoke slowly, carefully. I gave details without embellishment. I could hear his breathing change on the other end of the line, shorter, tighter, like his body was bracing for impact before his mind caught up. He asked me to repeat everything. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Is Sophie okay?" That question told me everything about the kind of man my father was. He asked me not to confront Mom yet. He said he needed time to think, to process, to decide how to handle it. He sounded calm, but I could hear something brittle underneath it. I told him I understood, but the truth was I didn't, because Sophie was sitting on my couch, curled into herself, eyes dull with shock. And I couldn't just sit there knowing my mother was sleeping in the house where my sister had just lost her sense of safety. So while Dad asked for patience, something else was growing in me, a quiet certainty, that this wasn't just about infidelity. This was about choosing whether to protect the truth or protect the illusion. And I already knew which one I was going to break. I didn't tell Sophie where I was going. Not because I wanted to lie, but because I didn't want her to feel responsible for what came next. Henry stayed with her. He made tea she didn't touch. He sat nearby without pressing, without asking questions she couldn't answer yet. When I grabbed my keys, he looked at me once and said quietly, "Be careful." I didn't respond. I was already halfway out the door. I drove toward my parents' house with my hands locked tight around the steering wheel, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might bruise my ribs from the inside. The streets were empty, too quiet, like the world didn't know what was about to shatter. I parked a few blocks away in the grocery store lot because I didn't want my car in the driveway. That felt important. I don't know why, maybe some instinct to avoid being seen, to keep control over something, anything. I used Sophie's spare key. The door opened without resistance. The first thing I noticed wasn't the silence. It was the shoes. Men's sneakers by the front door. Expensive, clean. Nothing like my dad's worn work boots that usually sat there, dusted with drywall and age. These were newer, sleeker, wrong. I took mine off automatically, like muscle memory kicked in even as my thoughts raced. I moved through the house slowly, each step heavy with dread. There was light spilling from upstairs, from my parents' bedroom. That light felt accusatory, like proof. I stood outside the door for a full minute, listening to my own breathing, feeling my pulse in my ears. I remember thinking, if I don't open this door, maybe it won't be real. Then I opened it and turned on the overhead light. The room froze. My mother was in bed with a man who looked barely out of college. He startled like an animal caught in headlights, wide eyes, scrambling movements, grabbing his clothes from the floor without even looking at me. He didn't say a word. He ran past me, down the stairs, the front door slamming hard enough to rattle the walls. My mother sat up slowly, pulling the covers around herself like that could erase what I'd just seen. She said my name. Then she said, "I can't explain." Her voice was shaking, not with shame, at least not yet, but with calculation, like she was trying to figure out how much damage had already been done. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell. I told her Sophie had come home unexpectedly. I told her Sophie had seen everything. I explained exactly why Sophie had been there. So there would be no room for denial, no way to twist the story into an accident or misunderstanding. That's when my mother's face changed. Not when I confronted her. Not when the man ran out. But when she realized her 16-year-old daughter had witnessed it. She asked if Sophie was okay. I told her Sophie was traumatized. I told her Sophie was sleeping on my couch, exhausted from crying. I told her that image would live in my sister's mind, whether she wanted it to or not. That's when my mother started crying. She asked if I was going to tell my father. I told her I already had. The color drained from her face. She said it was the first time. I didn't believe her. I stood up and told her not to contact me again. Then I said something I hadn't planned, but once it left my mouth, I knew it was true. I told her that Henry and I were starting a family, that our child would have a grandfather and an aunt, but not a grandmother. I told her I hoped whatever she'd chosen tonight was worth what it was costing her. She followed me down the stairs in her bathrobe, crying, swearing it was a mistake, begging me to listen. I didn't stop walking. When I got back to my apartment, Sophie was asleep on the couch, her face still streaked with dried tears. Henry sat nearby, watching over her like a guard. I didn't wake her. I just stood there for a long moment, looking at my sister, at how small she looked, curled into herself, and understood something with painful clarity. The moment had already happened. There was no undoing it. And from that point on, every choice we made would decide what kind of family survived the fallout. Morning didn't bring relief. It brought consequences. The sun came up like it always did. Soft light through the blinds, birds outside, the city waking up as if nothing had changed. But inside my apartment, everything felt suspended, like we were all holding our breath, waiting for impact. Sophie woke up first. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat up on the couch, eyes unfocused, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders like the room was too cold, even though it wasn't. When she finally looked at me, her voice came out flat. "Is it real?" I nodded. That was all it took. She folded in on herself again, knees pulled to her chest, silent tears slipping down her face. No sobbing, no drama, just grief settling in quietly, like it knew it was going to be here for a long time. Henry made breakfast none of us touched. About an hour later, my phone rang. It was Dad. His voice sounded older, tired in a way I'd never heard before. He told me he hadn't slept. He said he'd gone for a long drive after our call, just to keep his hands busy while his mind spiraled. Then he said the words that made everything permanent. "I'm filing for divorce." He said it calmly, not angrily, like he'd already crossed the emotional bridge and there was no point standing on it anymore. He asked about Sophie again, asked if she was safe, asked if she wanted to stay with him instead of going back to the house. When I told Sophie, she didn't hesitate. "I don't want to go back there." That was it. By noon, Dad had called a lawyer. By evening, Sophie was packing her clothes into trash bags because it was faster than finding suitcases. She only went back to the house once to grab the rest of her things, and she didn't go alone. Mom wasn't there. She was staying with Carol. That should have made things easier. It didn't. Sophie barely spoke for days. She quit the volleyball team because she couldn't focus. She stopped laughing at Henry's jokes. Her phone stayed face down on the table, unanswered messages piling up from friends she didn't know how to explain this to. Dad tried to be strong. He cooked. He made schedules. He enrolled Sophie in a new school closer to Uncle Mike's house so she wouldn't have to drive past our childhood home every day. At night, though, he sat on the back steps staring at nothing. Henry and I told Dad about the pregnancy a few days later. He smiled. He hugged me carefully, like I might break. He said he was excited to be a grandfather. Then his eyes filled, and he apologized for crying. "I just needed something good," he said. Mom tried to reach all of us. Calls, texts, voicemails. Long apologies that I deleted without reading most of the way through. She said she wanted to explain. She said she made a mistake. She said she loved us. But every message felt the same, focused on her pain, her regret, her fear of losing us. Not once did she ask how Sophie was sleeping. Not once did she ask what Sophie needed. That's when my anger sharpened into something clearer. This wasn't just about an affair. It was about priorities. And Sophie was learning, far too young, what it felt like to be collateral damage. I lay awake one night staring at the ceiling, Henry's arm warm around my waist, and wondered if I'd handled that first confrontation wrong, if I'd been too harsh, too final. Then I remembered the look on Sophie's face when she told me what she'd seen, and the doubt disappeared. Some lines, once crossed, don't deserve gentle reactions. They deserve protection. For about 2 weeks, things existed in a fragile kind of quiet. Not peace, just the absence of open conflict. Dad focused on logistics, lawyers, paperwork, making sure Sophie had what she needed. He kept himself busy in a way that felt deliberate, like if he stopped moving, everything would catch up to him at once. Sophie stayed mostly in her room. The counselor at her new school said this kind of withdrawal was normal after a shock, but knowing that didn't make it easier to watch. She slept with the light on. She flinched when her phone buzzed. She stopped asking questions about the future. Mom, on the other hand, didn't go quiet. She went desperate. She started trying to reach Dad through Carol, asking for one conversation. Carol framed it as closure, as something Mom needed to say so she could move on. Dad refused at first, but Carol kept pushing, insisting that one meeting wouldn't hurt anything. That was the first crack in Dad's resolve. When he told me he was considering it, my chest tightened. I told him I thought it was a mistake. I reminded him of Sophie, of the nights she woke up shaking, of how small she'd become inside herself. I told him that Mom didn't need closure at the expense of everyone else. Dad listened. Then he said something that scared me. "I loved her for 26 years, he said. "I can't turn that off overnight." So we met her. A coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, daylight. Carol came with Mom, but stayed at another table when Dad asked for privacy. Mom looked unwell. She'd lost weight. Her hair was pulled back carelessly. She was wearing one of Dad's old sweatshirts, which felt intentional in a way that made my skin crawl, like she was trying to remind him of something familiar, something shared. She talked fast, too fast. She said the man's name was Tyler. She said he was 24, a personal trainer at her gym. She claimed they'd only been talking for a couple of months, that nothing physical happened until the night Sophie came home. Then she blamed Dad. She said he worked too much, that she felt lonely, invisible, that Tyler made her feel young again. Dad's face went red. He told her that loneliness wasn't an excuse to destroy a family, that nothing she said justified what she'd done to Sophie. Mom cried, promised to quit the gym, promised to never see Tyler again, begged for counseling, begged for a chance. I expected Dad to stand up and walk out. Instead, he sat there, silent, processing. When we left, he told me he needed time. 2 days later, he told me he was willing to try counseling. That's when Sophie shut down completely. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just went quiet. For 3 days, she barely spoke to Dad. When she finally did, she said something that still echoes in my head. It feels like you're choosing her over me. Dad tried to explain forgiveness, tried to explain complexity. Sophie heard abandonment. She asked to stay with Uncle Mike permanently. Dad agreed. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get more tangled, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. It was Tyler. I almost hung up. But then he said he needed to talk to me because there were things I didn't know, and that Dad deserved the truth before making any final decisions. When I hesitated, he said one sentence that changed everything. She lied about how long we were together. I agreed to meet him at a diner near my apartment. Public, neutral. Tyler looked exhausted, guilty, not triumphant. He apologized before he even sat down. Then he told me the truth. The affair hadn't been 2 months. It had been almost 6. It started when Mom hired him as her trainer in January. Flirting, texting, then physical. She told him she and Dad were basically separated, that they slept in different rooms, that the marriage was over in everything but paperwork. She'd shown him apartment listings. She talked about moving in together. She talked about a future. When Sophie caught them, everything collapsed. Mom admitted she'd lied. Tyler ended it immediately. Quit the gym. Tried to disappear. But Mom didn't let go. She kept calling, begging, promising. Tyler showed me the messages, the dates, the proof. I took photos of everything. Sitting in my car afterward, I realized what this meant. If I told Dad, it would end any chance of reconciliation. If I didn't, Sophie would be asked to live with a lie. That night, I went to Uncle Mike's house and asked Dad to come into the garage with me. I showed him everything. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he thanked me. 3 days later, he called Mom and told her counseling was off. The divorce was moving forward. And this time, he sounded at peace. But Mom wasn't done escalating. She was just getting started. The fallout didn't come with explosions. It came with exhaustion. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes even breathing feel like effort. When Dad told Mom the divorce was final, no counseling, no second chances, she unraveled in ways I wasn't prepared for. She called me first, her voice high and frantic, asking if I was the one who told him about Tyler. I didn't lie. I told her Dad deserved the truth. She said I'd ruined her last chance, that I'd destroyed what could have been saved, that I'd chosen sides. I told her she'd made her choices months ago. Then I hung up. After that, the messages kept coming. Not apologies anymore, accusations. Long texts about betrayal, about how I'd always judged her, about how I thought I was better than her. I stopped responding entirely. That's when things shifted from painful to frightening. Mom started showing up places. At first, it seemed coincidental. The grocery store Henry and I went to on Sundays. Sophie's school play, where she appeared uninvited, sitting 3 rows back like a ghost Sophie couldn't ignore. Then Dad called one afternoon, furious and shaken, because Mom had shown up at his work site, standing near the trucks, crying in front of his crew. He asked her to leave. She didn't, not until he threatened to call the police. We told ourselves she was just struggling, grieving, that this would pass. Then Carol called. Her voice was tight, apologetic, before she even started talking. She said she'd been staying with Mom since the divorce finalized because she was worried. She said she'd tried to help, tried to redirect her, tried to talk sense into her. But then she found the notebooks. Pages and pages filled with notes, times, places, our routines, where Sophie went after school, when Dad left the house, when Henry and I usually went out, who we talked to, what days we were predictable. Carol was shaking when she told me. She said Mom was convinced she could fix everything if she just showed up enough, if she reminded us she existed, if she created situations where we'd need her again. Then Carol told me something that made my stomach drop. Mom had called Henry's workplace. She'd pretended to be a concerned family member, claimed I was having complications with my pregnancy, suggested I wasn't being properly monitored. Nothing came of it. The lie didn't hold up, but Henry had been pulled aside by his manager and asked if everything was okay at home. The humiliation burned through me like acid. Then there was Sophie's school. Mom had called there too, alleging neglect, alleging instability. Again, nothing stuck, but the intent was clear. She wasn't trying to reconnect. She was trying to regain control. That was the night Sophie came into my bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and asked in a small voice, "Is Mom going to show up here?" I pulled her into my arms and told her no, but I didn't know if that was true. Dad contacted his lawyer the next morning, with the call logs, the messages, Carol's statement. They filed for a temporary restraining order. When Mom was served at work, she spiraled. Carol said it finally snapped something into place. Shock, embarrassment, reality. Mom called Carol crying, saying she didn't realize how bad it looked. Promising to get help, promising to stop. But the damage was done. Dad installed a security system, changed the locks. Sophie stopped sleeping with the light on, but only because she slept with music playing, something loud enough to drown out her thoughts. Henry and I sat at our kitchen table one night, hands wrapped around mugs gone cold, and I admitted something I hadn't said out loud yet. "I'm not sad," I said. "I'm relieved." Henry didn't judge me for it, because relief doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It means the waiting is over. And in that moment, with my family fractured and my mother unrecognizable, I realized we were standing at the lowest point, the place where you stop hoping things will go back to normal, and start deciding what kind of future you're willing to fight for instead. The restraining order changed the air. Not magically, not overnight, but enough that we could finally breathe. For the first time in months, there were no surprise appearances, no late-night voicemails, no second-guessing every shadow in a parking lot or unfamiliar car idling too long. Mom followed the order, at least on the surface. And that silence did something important. It gave us space to see the truth clearly. Dad stopped flinching when his phone rang. Sophie started laughing again, tentative at first, like she didn't trust the sound of her own joy. She joined the debate team at her new school, discovered she was good at arguing her point with logic instead of emotion, and came home one afternoon smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. I realized then that this wasn't about salvaging the past. It was about protecting the future. The real turning point came quietly. One night, Dad and I were sitting on his back porch, the hum of cicadas filling the space between us. He looked older than I remembered, but steadier too, grounded in a way that comes from finally choosing truth over comfort. "I used to think loyalty meant staying," he said, "even when something was wrong." He paused, then added, "Now I think loyalty means refusing to lie, especially to the people you're supposed to protect." That was it. No dramatic declaration, no final confrontation, just clarity. Mom didn't lose us because of one mistake. She lost us because every step after that was about herself, her image, her pain, her fear, while Sophie was left to carry trauma she never asked for. We stopped engaging entirely. Everything went through lawyers. Carol moved out of Mom's apartment and went back to her own life, exhausted and heartbroken, but finally honest about what she could and couldn't fix. Sophie asked me one afternoon if it was okay that she didn't miss Mom. I told her the truth. "You're allowed to miss who she was," I said, "and still protect yourself from who she is now." That answer seemed to settle something inside her. Henry and I focused on building something stable, safe, predictable. We talked about the baby constantly, not in fear, but in hope. We made plans that didn't include chaos or manipulation. And somewhere in that quiet rebuilding, I realized something else. We hadn't destroyed our family. We'd stripped away someone who was actively hurting it. And once I understood that, the guilt finally loosened its grip. Consequences don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they arrive as absence. The divorce finalized quietly. No courtroom drama, no last-minute pleas, just signatures, dates, and the slow, administrative dismantling of a marriage that had already ended months earlier. Dad kept the house, not because he wanted it, but because stability mattered more than symbolism. He wanted Sophie to finish high school without being uprooted again. He wanted her to walk the same hallways, sleep in the same room, feel like at least one part of her life hadn't been taken from her without consent. Mom moved into a small apartment across town and went back to working full-time at the dental office. From what Carol told us, carefully, sparingly, Mom didn't talk about the divorce like something she caused. She talked about it like something that happened to her, about betrayal, about unfairness, about being misunderstood. People listened less and less. That was the real fallout. Not punishment, not revenge, but credibility eroding, one interaction at a time. Friends stopped returning calls. Gym acquaintances distanced themselves. Tyler, who she'd tried to contact again, blocked her completely. She wasn't vilified. She was quietly believed less. Dad, on the other hand, found his footing. Not immediately. Healing isn't neat. Some nights he still stared too long at the television without watching it. Some mornings he moved through the house like he was bracing for something to jump out at him. But he didn't question his decision anymore. That mattered. Sophie blossomed in ways that felt almost disorienting to watch. Debate gave her a voice that wasn't rooted in fear. She started standing straighter, talking faster, arguing confidently. She learned that being heard didn't require being loud or dramatic. She just needed truth. Henry and I got married quietly at the courthouse. No spectacle, no extended guest list, just his parents, a few friends, and Sophie standing beside me with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a long while. When I was 6 months pregnant, Dad came to our ultrasound appointment. He cried when he heard the heartbeat. Not the dramatic kind of crying, just tears slipping down his face while he held my hand like he was anchoring himself to something good. Mom wasn't told. Not out of spite, out of protection. The restraining order eventually expired, and we chose not to renew it. Not because everything was forgiven, but because boundaries had been established clearly enough that escalation no longer served anyone. Mom followed them, mostly. Through Carol, we heard she'd joined a support group, that she talked a lot, that she still framed herself as the center of the story, that she hadn't fully accepted responsibility, but wasn't actively trying to insert herself into our lives anymore. That was enough. The fallout wasn't explosive. It was decisive. And for the first time, we weren't reacting. We were choosing. Grace turned 1 last month. She took her first steps in my living room, wobbling forward with complete faith that someone would catch her if she fell. Sophie was the one crouched in front of her, arms open, laughing so hard she had tears in her eyes when Grace finally collapsed into her. Dad filmed the whole thing, his voice shaking as he narrated every tiny movement like it was the most important event in the world. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. This is what survived. Not the marriage, not the illusion, not the version of family built on silence and denial. What survived was honesty. Our lives are quieter now, smaller, maybe, on paper. Fewer birthdays to juggle, fewer holidays to navigate carefully, fewer people demanding access to us just because they share DNA. But what we have is real. Sophie is graduating high school in a few months. She's been accepted to colleges she's proud of. She talks about the future like it belongs to her again. She still sees a counselor occasionally, but she doesn't carry the weight the way she used to. When people ask about our mother, she doesn't freeze anymore. She just says calmly, "We're not close," and moves on. Dad is happy in a way I've never seen before. Not euphoric, steady. He's dating a woman named Patricia, kind and patient, someone who doesn't rush him or compete with his past. Sophie likes her. That matters. Henry and I bought a house 3 blocks from Dad's place. Grace toddles between rooms like she owns the world. She knows her grandfather's laugh. She knows her aunt's voice. She knows safety. As for my mother, I don't carry anger anymore. I carry clarity. I understand now that forgiveness doesn't require proximity, that empathy doesn't demand self-sacrifice, that loving someone doesn't mean letting them harm you repeatedly and calling it family. Grace may ask about her grandmother someday. When she does, I'll tell her the truth. Gently, honestly, without bitterness. I'll tell her that some people don't know how to love without controlling, and that it's okay to walk away from that. The biggest lesson this story taught me isn't about betrayal. It's about boundaries, about how protecting a child, your sister, your daughter, yourself, sometimes means burning down the version of family you were told to preserve at all costs, and that doing so doesn't make you cruel. It makes you responsible. We didn't lose our family. We rebuilt it on truth, on safety, and on the quiet, radical idea that love should never require silence.